So that's Corranderk. Thank you, Kate, for pulling up that map for us. Just off Maroondah Highway up near Healesville, you can see the Yarra River running through the valley. And you can see, I'm assuming that this is Badger Creek. Comes down through, you know where Healesville Sanctuary is? Yeah. Badger Creek runs through there. I was fortunate enough to live up in Badger Creek for a couple of years. And I met Auntie Dot Peters, who was one of the elders there from Corranderk. And as I was watching that, I was just, she's very much like Joy Murphy. Very, very warm, very, very concerned to maintain good relationship with everyone. And I'm always amazed by that warmth and generosity from a people who've been so profoundly brutalised. Yeah.
It's tricky though as well. I mean, we need to talk further to people, but if you're in a position of being a minority and the least powerful and not having equity of power and resources, then you can't really.
Yeah.
You're not in a position to fight.
That's right.
And you've actually got to use political tools and relationship to achieve anything, to get anything done. You know, you can't be aggressive and demanding.
Because you're immediately dismissed.
Yeah.
That was interesting. That's what they were saying with Green, that the whole why he wasn't able to advocate for Aboriginal people more is because he wasn't connected with the other white people, and so it was passionate about helping them, but he had no connection with it.
The networking tools.
So do you know how big Corranderk is roughly?
It might say down the bottom if you scroll up, because it's got information down the bottom.
It doesn't have it. Just looking at that, I would say it would be somewhere in the order of 100 acres. Yeah, 100 to 150 acres maybe.
When you think about how big Victoria is, it's amazing that there was so much arguments about such a little bit of land.
Yeah. And that's an astute comment, because it reveals actually that the land wasn't the issue.
Yeah.
No.
It was the autonomy.
Yeah. It was what this community represented.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did I send you the second page or just that page? Because the reason for its listing.
No, just that page.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So let me see if I can find it. I think that's the Gazette. So it lists the reasons for its heritage listing. Why it's such a problem. It's associated with an uncommon and unusually early system for managing Aboriginal people and reserves that provide for Aboriginal autonomy and self-determination rather than paternalistic control and direction. So that's what they were trying to get back. The government was trying to regain control. And it was underpinned by a court managed by the Kulin, an early geographical organisation of the settlement which precluded surveillance by managers, so they couldn't be watched, and the economic development of the reserve by its Kulin residents. So it's recognised as a place that was central to the development of Aboriginal policies and legislation, which had a significant influence over other jurisdictions, including the segregation and protection regimes and forced absorption and assimilation of Indigenous peoples. So it's kind of seen as a bit of political hot potato. So yeah, it wasn't about the land.
Yeah.
Wikipedia says that today it's 0.81 of a kilometre squared.
Oh yeah, it was carved up at one point, yeah. So
Okay.
before 1900, part of it was carved up and sold, I think, or just after.
Yeah, well, so it was in private hands for 50 years, according to that.
Yeah, but part of it was
so it would have been cut off, and yeah.
Before that,
Oh, okay, right. Yeah.
by the board, protection board.
So what I've suggested here, and this is just really just a point to sort of throw out there to provoke conversation about spiritual care in the context of this kind of abuse and trauma, because remember that's always the context within which we're asking these questions in this unit. So the humility to recognise the resilient power and agency of people who carry their trauma as memory and who dwell in the present as powerful agents of their own unfolding story. Barak seems to me to represent that kind of person, you know, carrying memory, carrying trauma, and living as a powerful agent. And the extraordinary thing about John Green is that he and his wife, because remember it wasn't just John, he and his wife married when he was 27 and she was 22, and the day after they were married they moved from Scotland to Australia, to Healesville basically. Can you imagine it? I mean obviously it used to take a significant amount of time to get there, but and she had 12 children at Corandurk. They lived there for 12 years. And then what I didn't realise and what we heard there was that when they got booted off, they bought the property next door, which I love that, you know. You can just sort of see them going, you know, to the establishment, not going anywhere. And there we've got a great example of spiritual care as political and social resistance, radical commitment to social justice.
And as subversive and as isolating, because often an experience of spiritual care is in systems, in institutions and organisations, is that you occasionally have to go out on a limb, and you're kind of isolated from other professionals or other groups because you're standing beside the vulnerable. So that can happen. It can be pretty tough at times.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people don't understand spiritual care.
Absolutely. There's a great little PDF here that I picked up on Corandurk and in particular on John Green's, and I'll photocopy this and I'll scan this and put it up on ARC. But it reveals a little bit more about John Green and his role in this kind of spiritual care. Now, first of all, I don't want us to romanticise John Green. He was a Scottish Presbyterian, and his interests were clearly in conversion. That's the basis from which they operated. That's all the missions operated from that perspective.
And finding a way to manage the Aboriginal people, the peace.
That's right. However, holding that broader context, it's still his model of doing what he was doing as a spiritual carer is worth looking at, isn't it? Given the context, the broader context within which they were operating. And this statement, you know, because he was actually part of the protection board for a considerable amount of time, and had to defend his approach on a number of occasions. And he says, "I know that I could move the Aborigines if I could assure them it was for their good to do so, because I could speak to them as men and brothers, and I know they would go." So he's talking about the level of relational trust that's there between them. "But I will not try, decidedly not." I find that to be a very powerful statement of spiritual care, standing in the way of the forces that were attempting to completely dissipate what was going on.
Becoming aware of your own power
Yeah.
and choosing not to exercise it, but being aware that
Right.
it's there.
Yeah.
And that's
And-
a huge thing for a spiritual care practitioner.
Yeah. And I think in the context of trauma, because often people who are living with post-traumatic conditions and behaviours and so on in their lives are irritants to wider society. You know, their behaviour is unsettling, it's irritating, it's ill-mannered, you know, doesn't conform to standards, morals, whatever. And it's tempting for spiritual carers to get caught in a triangulation situation where they are offering spiritual care in actual fact in an attempt to coerce the traumatised person to conform to the interests of a third party. And a classic example is of a real situation that I was made aware of where a spiritual carer was visiting someone's mother who was not behaving in a way that was conforming to the desires of the family. And so the spiritual carer was contacted by the daughter and asked to visit the mother on behalf of the family in order to try and help her see things the way they wanted her to see them. And the way this spiritual care encounter played out was that the spiritual carer ended up actually representing the interests of the third party, not the person that they were actually encountering. And we went through that. Yeah, it was a learning situation for the person involved, and we discussed that whole dynamic. And what strikes me about John Green is that he never allowed himself to be coerced into caring for this community in a way that represented the interests of the colonial government.
As far as we know.
As far as we know.
We have to,
Right.
we
Yeah.
have to footnote that.
And all we've got to go on, of course, is the collective memory of him. And I think it says in here somewhere that the relationship between the Corranderr community and John Green wasn't always, you know, rosy and dandy. We remember that they're all human beings, and there would have been all kinds of.
I think the really interesting part of that is that they developed a deep friendship.
Yeah.
I think that was an interesting thing.
Yeah.
That was a friendship.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me too, the establishment of common humanity, you know, we've talked a lot about Ray Gaita's philosophy of establishing common humanity through relationship. And because in fact the real spiritual carers of the Corranderr community were the people themselves. They had it, you know, they didn't need a white fella to care for their spirits in that
No,
sense.
they did not.
And John Green recognised that, and they recognised that. And really what John Green's role was, in a sense, was to stand in between the opposing forces and what was going on there, in a sense. Maybe that's romanticising it a bit too much, but
romanticising it. I think that there sounds to me like there was a great deal of influence in how to survive in this new colony from him. I think there would have been a lot of influence, and that may well have been good advice. You would know, but it was certainly. I don't think that was spiritual care. I don't think his role was spiritual care. He might have been a religious figure in their community.
There's no
but
doubt
it
about
wasn't
that.
spiritual care
Mm.
because he was trying to help them figure out how to survive in the colony. He was a political representative for them.
To what extent would you say his care was spiritual, and to what extent would you say it wasn't spiritual?
To the extent that he became the holder of the expertise, and they all became very dependent on him.
That's really interesting, because I didn't catch that from the dialogue in that. I get where you're coming from, because there's no doubt that in all of the dialogue with government side was that we want John Green. And
no other solution is going to be okay for us. We can't see beyond, potentially, and this is all speculative, potentially the only solution that we can find is to have him, because he's the only one that we can trust. He's the only one that knows what we need.
What was it?
I don't know. I reckon they've recognised that he's an advocate, yes, they can trust, but they know, I think it was pretty clear that they knew that without a white person on their land, then they weren't going to be safe. And so let's have someone that we can trust, who gets us, who's prepared to listen to us and let us live the life that we want to live. And it's a similar story for the Jackson's Track story, in that Daryl Tonkin and his brother, they bought the land, and the Aboriginal people knew they were safe so long as Daryl Tonkin and his brother were there, in a sense, because there was a kind of degree of safety placed when a degree of safety that was afforded Aboriginal people when there was a white advocate.
And that's a kind of an uncomfortable truth, isn't it?
It's an uncomfortable truth, but I think it's not. I didn't get the impression that the Aboriginal people were beholden to Green. I think they recognised relationship and
more
the utility of it as well.
sophisticated than that. I
Was
don't
it-
think you can.
Was it strategy rather than dependence?
Yeah,
Right,
it's,
yeah,
It's
yeah.
more sophisticated than what you're describing. I don't think we can know.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
certainly think that his influence was huge.
Yeah.
And their strategies appeared to be all their eggs in one basket to a degree.
Mm.
That basket was
It was that strong voice, wasn't there, that when if we can't have John Green, we don't want anyone. Like, you know what I mean? Like, we can do this on our own.
and yet John Green had been part of the protection board. He had, as somebody said, made himself no friends. He was maybe a bad advocate for them because he didn't know how to do the politics. And so, maybe it wasn't in their best interests that he was there one egg in a basket,
Although I think they still seem to think of other strategies other than John Green, because after he left and they made that friend with, what was the lady's name?
Oh, Anne Bond, yeah.
Anne Bond, even though Tim, that's proven not to be completely trustworthy. So you can see them trying to reach out to other white people, trying to march to Melbourne, but just not being able to find that trustworthy person.
Yeah.
Anne Bond wasn't about to leave her comfortable house and go live with them, even though she was sort of friends with them for a while.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty clear that different actors in that story had different agendas, and that's Anne Bond, we kind of go, an ally, but she misses something, and John Green, an ally, but maybe he was missing something too in terms of kind of political networking and political clout. The people themselves, they've got their own powers that they're exerting as they can within a Western kind of world. But in terms of spiritual care, is spiritual care just the conversation at the bedside, the one-to-one, or the in the room, or the small group, or the ritual, or the prayer, or the religious, or the... I think what we could probably glean from some of the story from Corin Dirk is that spiritual care is always the deep listening and giving attention to, and checking if we're actually listening more to ourselves or to other, or are we doing both effectively? What's actually happening here? What is the meaning of this? But it's also about hearing the story and going, oh, okay, and I'm going to voice that story with someone's permission further up the track. I think there's something about John Green recognising the needs of the people of Corin Dirk, which was to exercise agency, to be connected with the land, to follow their own agenda. And he's going, well, this is my spirituality. They didn't have to listen. They didn't have to come over to his place once he left Corin Dirk. But there's something about
It's not
that
that
relationship
simple.
that is No, of course it's not.
That's
Nothing
not
is
that
nothing is
simple.
simple. But I think we can't say it wasn't spiritual care, but we can't say the whole thing was.
Yeah, I think that there's clearly elements of his way that could be said to be good examples of spiritual care, and elements that would do well to be examined under supervision.
Absolutely. But I
Yeah.
think there's something about relationships.
Yeah.
Because the
There's
convert had people recognised relationships.
Yeah,
Sorry.
absolutely. I mean, just before we go, there's a little transcript here. I'm not exactly sure which part of the review or which review it was part of, but there's a transcript here of Green being interviewed by one of the people reviewing Corindurk, and it's quite revealing. Shall I just quickly read it out to you before we go?
Can I say one thing before
Yeah,
you
yeah,
go?
yeah.
There was a point made in there when you had to go to Corindurk unless you became Christian.
All the missions were like, well, not
Actually, not Corindurk. Corindurk was a bit different.
Corindurk, that's
Yeah,
it.
yeah. If you read the actual documentation online about things, there was a lot more flexibility about it. So people had already been at Corindurk, so all the people came there before John Green came. He came after.
Yep.
So those people had assembled there with whatever beliefs they had at the time, and John Green came there afterwards, and there was the sharing of all those spiritualities of the story, right? But because Corindurk was so successful, then other reserves were set up. And when those reserves were set up, they had managers put into them, and they had to be Christian to go there. They had to convert.
That's so because
So, but that was a later thing,
Yeah,
and I
maybe
don't
so.
think it was a
Yeah.
thing of necessarily
Maybe
John
so.
Green.
Well,
It
yeah.
might have been the community by that
Do we
stage,
know?
so
Yeah.
that's right.
And I suppose we have to look at, like, not saying that makes it right or wrong that they had to be Christian, but the worldview at the time was a very Christian worldview, and the education system was all Christian back then, so to civilise people back then was, to their beliefs were all tied into that.
yes.
And I
So
love the Aboriginal
true,
community
and
took
it
that on
gets-
board.
It gets tricky
Very true.
because
Mm.
that was society, it wasn't just a religion, so it gets tricky.
I think for me, underlying all of it is this undeniable, irrevocable tragedy
Yes.
of colonisation, and I think what's represented in this conversation is the difficulty of trying to nut out what it means to be a true spiritual carer in contexts that are irrevocably broken. How do you actually be a person of integrity and attention when the very basis of your presence in a situation is dependent on structural evil and violence? It's really like it's the human dilemma, isn't it? And that's what we operate in.
And ultimately, we probably can't accurately assess anything because
No.
we weren't the recipients of that
Yeah.
spiritual care. Their
Yeah.
voices
Yeah.
would be the best ones to assess what that was like for them.
Yeah.
We're making
Yeah.
an assessment from a distance,
Yeah,
And
we
it's
are.
culturally and
interesting.
historically.
Because the majority of Aboriginal Australians identify as Christian, and I go, really? But then you meet someone like Cheryl who identifies as Christian, but then you listen to her spirituality, which is postmodern, grabbing bits from that make sense to her.
Yeah.
And the
And that's
majority
actually
of
really
the
common.
missions were Christian,
So,
and therefore people were
absolutely.
brought up in them.
That's
Absolutely.
right.
But the Aboriginal people won't deny their Christianity.
No,
Right?
well, because
So-
it's become part of their
Right,
culture.
yeah.
And you say that like it's a good thing.
No, I don't. I'm saying I absolutely agree, and that's where this conundrum happens. I'm not condoning the Christianisation of Aboriginal Australia at all. Yeah, I'm sorry you misunderstood me.
Yeah.
Because I'm actually going, this is what I find astounding.
Yeah.
I find it shocking.
Yeah.
And when I meet people like Cheryl and the Aboriginal people that I've met, and they say they're Christian, I can think, why?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, I find it tragic.
But at the same time, the Aboriginal people themselves who have taken that on board don't see it necessarily as a tragedy anymore. It might have been once.
So this transcript is after John Green has left Corindurk, and the person interviewing him is someone named Cameron, and the interview goes like this. Cameron, you established the Aboriginal station at Corindurk. Yes, about 19 years ago. I managed Corranderk for 12 years. You currently reside at Hillsville? Yes. Do you often see the blacks now? Yes, very often. Sick people come to me almost daily for medicine and advice, sometimes as many as 10 and 12. Are you aware that they are all favourable to you and your management of the place? Yes. Did you find them good workers? You never had any reason to complain? No, never. How did you manage when they disobeyed? Reasoned with them. You would not call in the police? No, never. Did you ever have to punish the blacks? No. He's a man of few words. I always treated them as free men and reasoned with them. I made a law with their own sanction and also fined some of them for drinking, but that was the Aboriginal law, that if any got drunk they were fined. They were fined and some of them were chastised according to their own law. If the Aboriginal is put into the question, he will strive to keep his own law. That is where I consider you have failed. Did you find them truthful as a rule? Very. And honest? And honest. Which of the two, the real blacks or the half-castes, did you find the best workers? I never found any difference. There were some splendid workers, both blacks and half-castes. Do you consider full blacks are as intelligent as the half-castes? Undoubtedly. Mixing the blood does not improve the intelligence? No. What led you to giving up your inspectorship? I do not know if you're aware of it, but I never received a penny for being in Corranderk. My engagement with the government was purely Inspector of Aborigines. For the first 4 years at Corranderk, I had to pay Harris out of my own salary. What was your salary? £300. And you had to pay your own expenses? Pay all my own expenses. I won't read all of it, but it's just interesting. Did your wife, Mrs. Green, receive no salary as matron? I asked for something for Mrs. Green, but they would never give her a penny, and she had often the whole correspondence to carry on. Am I to understand that you had not only the management of Corranderk, but also the inspection of 6 stations at £300 a year? Yes, decidedly. And so on and so on it goes. He's a man of few words. He's described in this document as being stubborn, but profoundly concerned with the plight of the downtrodden.
Are these the minutes from the commission?
This is a transcript from one of the what do they call it? The Royal Commission, basically. Yeah. So, an interesting person and an interesting study of whether or not the way he was with the Corranderk community was a form of spiritual care, and what we can learn from that. And we've run out of time.
Royal Commission's only allowed short.
Yes, right. Yeah. Thanks,
Because
folks.
that's